Good evening, everyone. I didn't get a chance to meet all of you. My name is Eric Walsh. I'm the city manager, and I want to thank you in advance for all the work you'll be doing over the next month and a half. Lori Houston, one of our assistant city managers, is going to kind of walk you through the context of where we're at in terms of our $1.2 billion proposed municipal bond. We do a municipal bond effort every 5 years, and we are in the beginning part of this process in terms of citizen input. You are one of 5 citizen committees of 32 individuals that are reviewing streets, drainage, municipal facilities, of course, the group tonight, housing, and then the 5th group is parks and open spaces. And so we'll walk through a presentation for you here shortly. I did want to introduce one of the 3 tri-chairs that the mayor has appointed for our bond process, Mr. Brandon Logan, who's here tonight. Round of applause for Brandon. Right, there you go. There are 2 other tri-chairs, Jamie Kowalski and Berto Guerra, who are also helping provide support to the co-chairs. Our co-chairs tonight, Shirley Gonzalez and Katie Vela, also appointed by the mayor. And the mayor has appointed co-chairs in each of the 5 groups. And so we'll walk through what the schedule is over the next month and a half. But I want to thank you. We have a lot of staff members here tonight from Public Works, Transportation, Neighborhood and Housing Services, our Chief Housing Officer over here on this side, and the City Attorney's Office, really here to help support this group and the co-chairs. And with that, I will turn it over to Lori Houston to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and good evening. I'm going to do a brief overview of the bond program and talk about the charge of this committee. And then I'm going to pass it on to Jameen Williams with our City Attorney's Office, who's going to talk about the ethics and guidelines for the committees. And then she'll pass it on to me, and I'll talk about our proposed recommendations. And then I'm going to bring up Ian Benavides, who's going to be talking about the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, which is the plan that's going to be serving as mainly the foundation for how you're going to proceed to the next steps of the bond process. So just a brief overview of where we are. So on October 13, 2021, staff recommend a $1.2 billion bond program that included 6 propositions. Within that, we also had public art of $15.7 million. That represents 1.5% of the bond projects, excluding the housing component. We also have $129 million for citywide projects, and then we recommended $87 million in regional projects. What we heard at that meeting on October 13th was that there was a lot of concern about too much money in the citywide projects, and there was some interest in increasing the basic infrastructure amounts among some of those propositions. And so what we did is we met with council members over the next couple days, and we came back on October 27th with a new recommendation. The propositions were still 6. It was still $1.2 billion, but we did reduce the citywide projects from $129 million to $99 million. We did increase the regional projects up to $102 million because during our first conversation, we heard from council members that they wanted the the Port SA project to be included. And then we kept public art at 15.7, but we did increase streets and drainage as requested by the council. Now, we were able to cut about $57 million in projects so we could add those $57 million in projects. So you'll see on the one column that says additions, we met with all the council members, try to understand what their concerns were, and we added several drainage projects, some street projects, park projects. We did add the Port SA, and then we added some money for some outside entities, specifically the K9 for Warriors partnerships. And then we cut $57.7 million in projects. Primarily, we cut the citywide projects, and then we cut some funding from the linear creekways, and then an SAPD project that was referred to as the impound lot relocation. So that's how we made our adjustments. But key is we still have a $1.2 billion bond program with those 6 propositions. I want to mention there's a lot of discussion about the linear creekways and linear trails. And so you'll see on this slide, we still have $110 million for the linear creekways that reduced from the 126. That will provide 20.3 miles in linear creeks, and then it will fund 16 projects. This was coordinated with our Parks Department and our Activate SA partners, and this will be reviewed by the Parks proposition. Now, as I mentioned, we have 6 propositions, streets, bridges, and sidewalks, and that is at $480 million. We have Parks and Recreation at $274 million, and that does include the $110 million for the linear creeks. We have Drainage and Flood Control at $162 million. Our housing proposition is $150 million. Municipal Facilities at $61 million, and then Public Safety and Health Facilities at $73 million. As you can see on the pie chart, the amount of bond funding by proposition, the largest by far is the streets, bridge, and sidewalks, and the drainage at about 53%. And then you have 23% for parks, 11% for facilities, and 13% for housing. And then the proposed categories. So district projects, so the streets and drainage projects that are considered neighborhood projects within each council districts, make up about 60%. We have housing at 13%. The linear greenways, those are among the city, across the city, that's 9%. And then our regional projects are at 9%, and citywide projects are 8%. Now, citywide projects at 8%, I want to stress a citywide project is a project where it's not just used by that council district. So an example of a citywide project would be something like the linear creekways. So the entire community is going to be using that project. Hemisphere Park, the entire community is using that project. A regional project is a project that's within one of the regional centers. So the regional centers were adopted by council. Those are the 13 areas where city council wants us to focus our growth. And so we want to make sure that we had a lot of projects that were going to help facilitate that growth. So that represents 9% of the 1.2 billion. So to help us with this, we have 5 bond committees. I know we have 6 propositions, but we have 5 bond committees because we combine the public facilities and the safety facilities into one committee. And so that is the facilities committee. So we have 5 committees: streets and drainage, drainage and flood control, parks, facilities, and housing. The mayor appointed 13 members of those committees, 3 tri-chairs. Then you have 10 co-chairs, 2 co-chairs for each committee. And then council was able to appoint 15 members across all 5 committees. So they each were able to appoint 3 members per committee. And then you have a total of 160 committee members among those 5 committees. As Eric mentioned, we have Brendan Logan, who is one of the tri-chairs for the 2022 bond program. But we also have Berto Guerra and Jamie Kowalski, who are serving along his side. And then we have the 10 co-chairs who are listed on this committee. We have streets, it's John Bailey and Paulo Fernandez, and each committee has been assigned an executive team member from Eric Walsh's team. And so Rod Sanchez is leading that committee along with the drainage committee, and that's being led by Chris Garcia and Suzanne Scott. And then you have David McCary, who's leading our parks committee, and that's being led by Jeanette Honerman and Jim Bailey. Our facilities committee is being led by our deputy city manager, Maria Villagomez. That's being led by Chris Martinez and Dwayne Robinson. And then you have the housing committee that's being led by myself. I'm Lori Houston. I'm an assistant city manager. And then your co-chairs are former council member Shirley Gonzalez and Katie Vela, who's the executive director of the South Alamo Regional Alliance for Homelessness. So thank you both for agreeing to serve. And they'll be helping us throughout this process. Now, this is all you. So we have 30 committee members. I'm not sure if we still have a vacancy, but we have 30 committee members plus the 2 co-chairs, and each of you represent a council district. And so we have 3 members from each council district represented on this committee. Now, unlike the other propositions and the other committees, this committee is not selecting projects. So what this committee is going to be doing is you are going to be recommending identifying priority categories and strategies that are identified in the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan that need to be prioritized for bond funding. And what this document will be used for is it'll help guide staff and stakeholders as we proceed through the housing bond project solicitation and selection process. And I'll talk more about that. And City Council when staff brings forward a project for recommendation and consideration for bond funding. Now, the priority categories and housing strategic objectives can be population-based, so you can choose to prioritize households of up to 30% AMI or homelessness. There's several categories that you all can talk about, and we'll be taking notes. And you can choose to focus on a product or a program. So, for example, maybe this committee wants to prioritize rental housing for populations of up to 30% AMI, and that could be something staff would consider as we move forward with soliciting projects. Now, the priority categories and housing objectives will be developed and based on this committee's feedback and public input, but I want to stress that the actual language that on the ballot will be very general to properly inform the public while providing needed flexibility to consider a range of projects that further the priorities and objectives of this committee. So I want to stress we are not selecting projects, we are selecting priority categories and objectives for funding. And Ian Benavides is going to be coming up here and doing a presentation on the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, and we'll go through that later on. Now, we have 3 meetings scheduled, but if we do need to have a 4th, we will be scheduling that. So today's meeting really is an introduction. We'll do an overview of the ethics guidelines and talk about the committee's charge, and then do a presentation on the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. Then the second meeting will be public comment and committee deliberation. And from that meeting, staff will start creating a document that identifies the priorities and the categories that will be sent to this committee for their review. Now, I want to mention that this document is going to be adopted by City Council in the form of a resolution. So when staff starts looking at how to proceed with projects, it's a framework we use, and it serves as an accountability tool. So when we go to council, we can say, we listened to the bond committee. This is the population and the product they wanted us to address. And so we'll be able to use that document as that evaluation tool. And then the third meeting will be staff presentation of the draft priorities and objectives, public comment, and possible committee action. But if the co-chairs decide we need a 4th meeting, we're able to accommodate that. So we have the Community Bond Committee meetings already scheduled, so you can see that our meetings are set for the 3rd and the 17th of November, and then our last meeting is set for the 8th. But if we need another meeting, we can add one in on the December calendar. Now, we are committed to transparency. We have all this information on the website. So if you go to this website, which is www.sanantonio.gov/2022 bond, you are going to find the committee roster, you'll find the meetings calendar, meetings documents, and the reports and presentations. Now, in addition to the 32 committee members, you have a room full of staff as well. And we are here to take notes and document all of your questions and all of your comments. We are committed to a 48-hour turnaround, so we will answer those questions and we will post them up on this website as well as email them to the entire committee. So any questions you have, we'll be documenting and getting back within 48 hours. Now, our next steps, so the bond committees are already meeting. Our meeting with the recommendations, where we have to have all the bond committee recommendations, is January 12th. And then February 10th is when City Council will approve the project list. And then May 7th is the actual date for the bond vote. Now, to talk more about ethics and meeting guidelines, I'm going to ask Jameen with our City Attorney's Office to come up and present. And then she's going to hand it back over to me, where I'm going to talk about the process and next steps and how we're going to create and prioritize these categories and objectives. So, Jameen?
Thank you, Lori. Good evening, committee members. My name is Jameen Williams. I'm an assistant city attorney, and I'm going to provide a short overview for you of the ethics and meetings, guidelines that we are expecting you to follow throughout this process. As you all may know, certainly those of you who have worked with the city before, the city has an ethics code and a finance code that governs the functions and activities of all of the city's boards and commissions that serve to carry out the business of the city. However, as Lori just explained, your charge on this committee is to serve as an advisory body to the city council as they determine how to call the bond election. So as such, the city's ethics code and campaign finance codes do not apply to you in the strict sense. However, we want you to still use your individual judgment in deciding whether to participate in a specific vote. And that's because we want to make sure that throughout the process, obviously this is a public engagement activity, so we want to be as transparent as possible and make sure that all of the proper considerations and activities are carried out. So we strongly recommend that each member of the committee recuse themselves from a matter if you have a conflict of interest. So what is a conflict of interest? A conflict is a bond project that is likely to directly affect the economic interest of the committee member's parent, child, spouse, or other close relative, or a business in which the committee member or family member has an interest. Again, since you are not a official board or commission of the city, you're not subject to the strict requirements of the code. However, we want to make sure that you use these as guidelines. Another provision that is laid out in our ethics code is a provision that governs unfair advancement and confidentiality. A committee member should not use their official position to gain an unfair advantage or to advance a private interest. For example, promoting your consulting firm, seeking to obtain confidential information to support a future bid proposal. A committee member may not disclose confidential information gained by their service on the committee, including representing any person, group, or entity before any of the committees. Another important guideline that we will need you to follow is our gifts provisions in the ethics code. Committee members should not accept any gift from any source that influences or rewards official conduct, or that the committee member knows or should know is being offered with the intent to influence official conduct. There are some exceptions to the gift rule. One is if it's an item of nominal value. So in other words, something that doesn't cost any particular, amount of value that would constitute a financial gift or something of that nature. Meals up to $50, no more than $500 total in a calendar year from a single source. That is accepted. Admission to training or educational programs if it's related to your official duties. Admission to events attended in a ceremonial capacity or as an official representative of the city. Gifts from friends that are in keeping with the personal, non-city relationship. I'm going to shift now to meeting protocols. This section is going to touch on some provisions of the Texas Open Meetings Act, as well as the procedural rules that we follow here in our city, or our boards, commissions, and city council, called Robert's Rules of Order. With respect to your functions here on this committee, the tri-chairs or co-chairs will preside over the meetings and will use the Robert's Rules as a guide to manage the meetings. For purposes of this part of the presentation, a meeting is any deliberation between a quorum of members at which any public business is discussed or considered, or at which any formal action is taken. So obviously, the meetings that you all are going to conduct throughout this process will meet the definition of a meeting under the Open Meetings Act, and so these rules therefore apply to you. A meeting, however, excludes social functions, conventions, or workshops. A meeting can include electronic communications. So you want to be careful with email communications, text messaging, or any other nonverbal communications if you are discussing the business of the city, or in other words, the business of your charge here today. That can constitute a meeting, and therefore the rules of the Open Meetings Act and these guidelines will apply. A quorum is a simple majority of the committee members. So it will constitute a meeting if a quorum or a simple majority of your entire body are present at the time that you discuss the business. A quorum of the committee should be present in the room to convene. So in other words, sorry, I need to make sure I'm moving the slides along. Let's see, let's go back. There we go. Okay. A quorum of the committee should be present in the room to convene a meeting. The committee may take action only on agenda items that have been posted. And a lot of times it's very easy to get off the agenda. So you want to make sure, and your co-chairs will be making sure that the agenda is followed. And of course, the purpose of that is to make sure that the meeting moves timely and efficiently. So that's very important. All of your meetings are going to be open sessions, open to the public, and therefore any votes that the committee takes must be done in the public session. The public may attend each meeting. The committee chairs may allow public comment and may limit time for comments. So the next couple of meetings, as Lori explained, are going to be specifically for public comment and public engagement. So the chairs will be permitted in their discretion to limit the amount of time each speaker may take to give their comments, and so that is perfectly within the guidelines. And that concludes my presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Lori at this time unless there are any questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Jameen. And Jameen will be at every bond committee meeting with us. I do want to recognize our city attorney, Andy Segovia, who has been helping out with this process as well, and he was able to attend tonight's bond committee meeting. So before I start, I know you all have a folder in front of you, and there's a lot of great material, but I do want to highlight 4 documents that are in there, just so you're aware of them. One, we have the HUD AMI limits. So as we talk about what AMI is, you will be able to use this as a reference document to understand what we're referring to. So if I say 30% AMI, I'm typically talking about a household size of 4 making less than $22,000 a year. But that document is in your folder for your reference. We also have a summary of our successes in the 2017 bond program. So I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation, but if you recall, in 2017, we did have a neighborhood improvements bond that provided $20 million to help with affordable housing. We also have a glossary of terms. So you'll see us use these terms throughout the next couple meetings, whether it's AMI, RFP, what room sharing means. So you can use this document or peruse through it just so you can get a reference of some of the housing terms that we're going to be using as we go through the SHIP. And then finally, there is a wonderful evaluation framework that was created by the Housing Commission, and it was approved in October of 2021. And it's a framework that identifies evaluation criteria for staff to use when we actually select projects prior to recommending them to council. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple slides. So briefly, in May of 2017, the San Antonio voters did approve $20 million for the neighborhood improvements bond. And what that did was really to help facilitate affordable housing. But because of our charter limitations, we could only do certain things with that money. Primarily, what we had to do is we had to purchase properties within certain areas that were designated by City Council. So we had 12 areas that were identified by the Neighborhood Improvements Bond Committee. They identified those areas as priority areas for affordable housing. And then what city staff did is we went out and sought out to purchase property within those 12 areas. And then what we had to do was prep them and then issue solicitations for affordable housing development. It was a very tenuous project and process. It added a lot of time. It really limited on what we could do. And what we had to do to provide more flexibility is we had to take a charter amendment forward to the voters that amended the charter to allow us to do more affordable housing and less limitations on where and how we could do it. But we did have some success. With that $20 million, we were able to do 4 projects. Those 4 projects produced 585 affordable units, or they will ultimately produce 580 affordable units. And that $20 million leveraged $97.3 million. And so there was success with that small amount of money. But as I mentioned, there were some limitations. So what we did is we sought out to do a charter amendment, and the previous city charter only allowed for public works in order for us to do affordable housing. What we did is we changed the charter to allow us to do affordable housing for the benefit of the community. And that charter amendment was approved in May of 2021. And that is what is going to allow us to have more flexibility as we go forward with this $150 million in the bond program. So instead of having to purchase property in certain designated areas, we can repair, rehab, or reconstruct owner-occupied homes throughout the city. We can maybe create a first-time home buyer down payment assistance program with the funding. We can provide incentives to reduce the cost of construction, which we refer to as gap funding. We could use it to help offset impact fees that are necessary to build these projects. We can do land banking or community land trusts. We can do rehab, repair, or preservation of rental units. And we can do conversion of mobile home parks and rental units to resident-owned communities. These are just a few examples of how we could use this bond funding. And this is specific to single-family housing. We also have options when we look at multifamily housing. We can use gap funding to increase the number of units to provide deeper affordability. We can refinance units that have expiring covenants. We can buy down rents to provide lower cost units. We can repair, rehab, or reconstruct multifamily units. We can fund permanent supportive housing for those that are unsheltered or homeless. And we can also use this for our impact fee waivers as well as land banking. So there's a variety of ways that we can use this money versus what we were limited to do in 2017. Now, as we go forward with this process, I want to point out 3 documents that are going to help guide us through this housing bond process. First, we have the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan that has been under development for the past 18 months. This plan is sourced from several other documents that have been adopted by City Council, and it uses the foundation of the Mayor's Housing Framework Policy to help get it to our next level. It really tells us what are our targets for production and preservation, and how do we get there? So that's what this document does. And Ian Benavides is going to talk more about that. The next document is the document that this committee is going to create. And this is the document we're referring to as the priority categories and housing strategic objectives. This document, once adopted by this committee, will be adopted by City Council. And what it's going to do is help us identify the populations that we need to prioritize for bond funding, as well as identify the strategies or products that we want to prioritize for bond funding. Then we have the third document, and this document was created by the Housing Commission, and this is the evaluation framework I referred to earlier. And that is really the evaluation criteria that staff or our stakeholders will use when selecting projects for bond funding consideration. So just high level, the SHIP, which is the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, I want to point out it's the foundation of the SHIP is the Mayor's Housing Policy Framework that was adopted by Council in 2018. It establishes new housing targets for the next 10 years. Those targets are divided by the area median income categories. So it looks at 0 to 30%, 30 to 50%, 50 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100, and up to 120 if you're looking at home ownership. It divides those goals by preservation versus production. So we want to preserve affordable housing. So we'll have a goal for how many units we need to preserve, and then how many new units do we need to produce. And then it breaks it out by home ownership versus rental. So Ian's going to show you that later on in this presentation. Then it develops a 10-year funding plan. And this 10-year funding plan identifies or leverages $3.3 billion in funding for us to implement these targets. And then it identifies 36 strategies that we can use to help implement these targets and help decrease the number of families in Bexar County that are cost burdened. So that is what the SHIP is, and that'll be considered by City Council in December. Now, the priority categories and housing strategic objectives, once again, what this committee is doing is that you all will identify categories and strategies within the SHIP that should be prioritized for bond funding. The categories and strategies can be population or strategy based. So once again, an example of a population that you want to prioritize could be up to 30% AMI. So those households making less than $22,000 a year. That's the population you want to prioritize. And then the product or the program that you want to prioritize could be rental housing. It could be permanent supportive housing. It could be home ownership. So we'll be going through those discussions over the next couple weeks. And the priority categories and strategies will help identify the types of projects and programs that may be pursued through the appropriate processes for bond funding. So for example, if this bond committee decides to prioritize the population that is households making up to 30% of the area median income, and they want to prioritize rental housing, city staff would take that information and we would issue a request for proposals to the community asking them to propose to us projects that meet those goals. And so that's how we'll use this document. Now, the last document I want to talk about is the one the Housing Commission created, which is the Housing Bond Evaluation Framework. And so what that framework does is it's going to use the information from this committee, and it basically says, prioritize what the Housing Bond Committee said to prioritize, and then make sure that we exemplify the SHIP core values of affordability, choice, quality, and accessibility, and connect vulnerable populations. It has 3 evaluation criteria that it wants us to measure these projects by. So connectivity, public health, and resiliency. And so in your packets, you all have that framework. But an example of how we're going to use this is, I'm going to go back to, this committee prioritizes up to 30% AMI households, and you want rental. We do an RFP for those projects. We get 10 projects back, let's say. Then we're going to evaluate them, and we're going to use this criteria to help evaluate them and score them. So when we go to City Council, we'll say, we issued or sought out projects that were in line with what the Housing Bond Committee wanted, and then we measured them against the evaluation criteria that the Housing Commission created. So before I pass it on to Ian, I really want to stress the importance of this coordinated housing system. So you saw all those 3 documents are interconnected. I want to stress the city does not build housing. What we do is we work with our partners, affordable housing partners, private developers, to build affordable housing. The Housing Bond Committee will not pick projects, but will prioritize the categories and strategies that are in the SHIP that will be funded using the Housing Bond funds. The process is to implement the priorities from the Housing Bond Committee. We'll use the Housing Commission's evaluation framework to score and evaluate projects for council consideration. The SHIP is a coordinating document. It's going to be adopted by the San Antonio Housing Authority, the San Antonio Housing Trust, and Bexar County is currently creating their housing document that is being coordinated with this document. And it's going to help us reach our community goals. Now, I want to stress that, again, we're selecting priorities and strategies for the use of bond funding. We're not selecting projects. That's unlike any other process you'll see in these other 5 committees. But we understand from the community input and from this committee input, we should be able to really extract how we want to prioritize that $150 million. So I want to hand it over to Ian Benavides, who is our Assistant Director for the Neighborhood and Housing Services Department. And he's going to give you an overview of our housing implementation plan and our next steps.
Thank you, Lori. Good evening, everybody. Ian Benavides, Assistant Director with our Neighborhood and Housing Services Department. I'm happy to be here, happy to meet you all, and excited to inform you a little bit on the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. I think Lori provided a lot of, one second, I just want to make sure this is working. There we go. Lori provided a really good context for what the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan is, and it's our roadmap as a city for the next 10 years to be able to provide affordable housing to those most vulnerable populations. I'm going to talk to you all about a couple of different things. One is, why are we doing the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan? Many of you may have participated in the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force and may be thinking, didn't we just do a big planning document, a big planning initiative? So why are we picking this up now? The need in our community. The SHIP approach, which is picking up on the housing policy framework's ideas of not just housing production, but also trying to address the other inequalities that lead to unstable housing. A 10-year funding plan that will be used to achieve our goals. The strategies sourced from the housing policy framework, as well as other planning documents that are being coordinated, and our public engagement to date and next steps. So as Lori stated, this document, the implementation plan, is really building off of all of the great work that went into the housing policy framework. That was a very long public engagement process that included numerous public meetings and really set housing as a foundational item for our community. Talked about housing as infrastructure, talked about providing residents the opportunity to live with dignity. And so what we've done is we've continued the work, or we've started the work in the housing policy framework, and we've identified some gaps where we needed to take it to the next level. Specifically, the housing policy framework included 24 strategies. I'll talk a little bit in another slide about how many we've done, how many are in progress, and how many we have yet to do that are being carried forward in the implementation plan. And it also set our community's first 10-year target of a little over 18,680 units. This was a great starting point. It really got us in the mode of trying to understand what kind of housing as a city are we producing right now, where are the gaps, and where do we need to go. So just to start, when we picked up the housing policy framework, the Neighborhood and Housing Services Department right away started working to address some of the strategies that were identified. Things like conducting an assessment of the San Antonio Housing Trust, reconstituting the San Antonio Housing Commission, creating a risk mitigation policy for individuals who are most vulnerable to displacement, hiring a chief housing officer, and issuing a charter amendment so that we could issue a full housing bond. Our department was also very busy during the pandemic in response to making sure that individuals had a place to call home and were not displaced. We transitioned our risk mitigation program into our emergency housing assistance program. We started a lot of work at our eviction courts in coordination with Bexar County to ensure that individuals had access to resources and didn't lose housing. We created a voucher incentive program and a notice of tenants' rights. And all of these policies weren't specifically mentioned in the housing policy framework, but was all work that we did during the pandemic. The second thing that we did is start to track our production pipeline. We had the target goals that the housing policy framework gave us, and they broke them down into a couple of categories: production and preservation for rental and home ownership. And once we began to track them, we saw that we were exceeding the goals in many areas. And this was a good thing. I think setting a goal, allowing us to see what we're doing, where we may be exceeding and where gaps may be, allowed us to reevaluate the types of funding that we utilize and where we need to redirect other funding. Seeing this was really the start of the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, making us take another look at our community and what the need was, and setting new 10-year targets. Where we started from setting new 10-year targets was really trying to define affordability. There's been a lot of discussion in the community at council, at Housing Commission, and other groups, even during the housing policy framework, about what is truly affordable in our community. Our goal was to establish a shared definition of affordable housing to be referenced across city departments and programs. And this started an 8-month process with the Housing Commission to help identify what exactly affordable housing is. We consulted with not just city departments, but also partner city agencies like CPS, SAWS, VIA, and our community housing development organizations or nonprofits that help us deliver housing. And this was really important because we talked about not just the housing itself, but household costs that contribute to housing affordability. The results of this analysis were looking at household affordability standard measurement, which is using the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD standard, is typically set at 80% of the area median income. We looked at that and we compared it to the census data for the city of San Antonio. And the reason that's important is because the Department of Housing and Urban Development uses a larger geographic area than just San Antonio. It considers outlying cities like New Braunfels, Alamo Heights, Balcones Heights, which has the effect of raising the average median income for allowable projects in San Antonio. So by comparing the two, we were able to lower our definition of affordability from 80% AMI to 60% AMI, which more accurately reflects the population of San Antonio. The resulting definition included 60% of area median income for rental households and up to 120% AMI for homeownership. The next thing that we did is try to analyze the community need. If we understand the community's need, it would be better to set targets for the next 10 years. We were able to do this in partnership with our consultant, Economic and Planning Systems, that was part of the original housing policy framework goals. We looked at cost burden within our community and supply-demand imbalances. The results of this analysis showed us that 95,000 households are the most vulnerable. These are households that are cost burden, and be it for no other source of intervention, would have nowhere else to go. There wasn't another unit affordable to their income level. This chart helps break down that 95,000 from homeownership and rental and by AMI category with the income levels. And these income levels are adjusted for a household size of 3, which is the average household size in the city of San Antonio. The key takeaway from this slide is that the majority of the need, almost 75%, is below 50% of the area median income. And about 50% of that is below 30% of the area median income. Once we identified the need, we had to decide how we were going to tackle it. We know housing production and preservation is a key component and something that our department is very focused on. But going back to the housing policy framework, we know that housing instability isn't only a housing production problem. There are other ways to address household instability, such as increasing incomes or providing assistance. So we work with our partners, not only within the city, but also partner agencies, to identify ways or programs that already exist in our community to increase household wages and subsidize incomes. We also looked at our partners to see how we can continue to produce and preserve more income-restricted units going forward. When we look at increasing household wages and subsidizing incomes, we're talking about things like public assistance. Housing choice voucher programs are able to subsidize the difference between what a household earns and what their rental costs are. Benefits navigation is also critical and something that we've utilized during the pandemic. Connecting households and residents to services that are out there can have the same effect of lowering other household costs so they can spend their money on housing. These are things like SNAP, child tax credit, and other programs that have existed prior to the pandemic, but also new ones. For job training, we know that the city has made a heavy investment in the SA Ready to Work program, but we also know that there's a lot of other job training programs in our community that have the same effect of raising household income to make housing more affordable to themselves. When we talk about producing and preserving housing, our department works very closely with our partners and will continue to do so on producing and preserving income-restricted units. We use things like gap financing and tax credits, and we utilize those to do things like owner-occupied repair programs and rental rehabs. But we also wanted to see how we could leverage the private sector. Almost 75% of the affordable housing in the country is currently naturally occurring and affordable. It's unrealistic to think that we can build only all subsidized housing to meet our needs. So how can we leverage the private sector to help meet that demand? We are looking through the SHIP at approaches like accessory dwelling units and home sharing that are able to better utilize the resources we already have. Accessory dwelling units or granny flats are able to provide a source of passive income for owners that may have fixed income and also allow residents to age in place. Things like home sharing make better use of units of space that may already be available without having to build a new unit and provide a passive source of income for individuals. We also looked at the UDC to see what changes we can make to encourage more affordable housing development. Things like density bonuses are used in other cities to be able to provide more affordable housing as an offset. Through that approach, we're looking at these 95,000 households as a variety of solutions. We're looking at our new affordable housing target of a little over 28,000 units. This is 10,000 over the original housing policy framework goal. More importantly, and I'll talk about it in the other slide, the targets identified in the new target goals meet the need identified in the community. We're looking at the private sector to provide a little over 25,000, nearly 26,000 units. We're looking at public assistance through benefits navigation and housing choice vouchers to provide 17,000. And we're looking at job training to provide us 23,000. Now, these are target goals. These are things that, working with our partners, we think we can achieve. We'll continue to track and monitor these, and I'll talk a little bit about how we are going to track and monitor them into the future. And if we need to make adjustments, we will. It's highly likely that some of these things may go over, and that's okay. But these goals are set to address the 95,000 households. And all of this ties back to the housing policy framework's key criteria of housing instability in our housing crisis. And that's that San Antonio's housing supply is not keeping pace with economic growth, and that housing costs are outpacing incomes in San Antonio. So for our new targets of 28,094 units, I want to spend a little time on this and talk a little bit about each of these targets and some of the high points. For homeownership production, we are including goals up to 120% AMI. Homeownership below 60% AMI is very difficult. There are some ways that we can do it, and so we'll be exploring those, things like community land trusts or land banking. For preservation, you'll see a very high emphasis on preservation at lower AMI levels. 0 to 30% and 30 to 50% make up a bulk of these numbers. For housing production, you will see a very large number on that 0 to 30% and 30 to 50%. And you'll also see that in our 0 to 30%, we're including 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing. Oh, really quickly on this side, I do want to mention that for 60 to 80%, we are not going to be including an affordable housing goal for that. And this is in response to the definition of affordability that only goes up to 60% of the area median income. Now, we will continue to track these. We know that when we build affordable housing, we may have to produce some 80% units to offset lower AMI AMI units. This is typically seen in housing tax credit projects where you're able to produce lower income units in exchange for higher income units. Now, there are strategies for us to be able to buy some of those down, but we do know that our ability to be able to produce those lower income units may result in 80% units. We'll continue to track those, but those will not count towards our target goals. Lori did an excellent job talking a little bit about the programs and how we're going to get there. Things like repair, reconstruction of owner-occupied homes. The city has a lot of really good programs right now, including minor repair, owner-occupied rehab, and under one roof. These homes help make minor repairs to homeowners who otherwise would not be able to. Income qualified. Owner-occupied rehab is more significant investment, typically over $100,000. And then under one roof replaces a homeowner's roof with a green, white reflective roof, extending the life of that home. For repair, rehabilitation, or reconstruction of rental units, typically what we see come to our office and through the state programs are larger rental developments. Through the SHIP, we're going to be looking at ways to preserve small-scale rental units within our community that we know are home to a lot of our affordable housing residents. Looking at first-time homebuyer down payment assistance, providing pathways to home ownership that was critical and highlighted in the housing policy framework. Incentives to reduce the cost of new construction. These could be things like gap funding, land banking, or buying down units, and increasing ownership opportunities. Conversion of mobile home parks or rental units to resident-owned communities. And lastly, community land trusts. Community land trusts that are able to separate the cost of a structure from the land of a home and make that home more lastingly affordable. So when we look at our new targets by AMI, you'll see that the new targets reflect the need in the community. 75% of the new targets are at or below 50% of the area median income. And I'm sorry, 75% of the new targets are at or below 50% of the area median income, and 50% of the targets are at or below 30% of the area median income. Again, this is tied to the need that we identified in our analysis. And the overall targets, the majority of them are preservation focused. So how will these targets be tracked? One of the key components of the housing policy framework was accountability to the public. So we'll be working with the Housing Commission to produce an annual report as well as a dashboard that will be available online We'll track all these metrics, and I'll talk a little bit about those metrics in a second. We'll provide monthly updates to the Housing Commission, who's charged with overseeing the housing policy framework and soon the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. And we'll provide quarterly reports to the Council Community Development Committee. So when we talk about tracking these numbers, we're going to be working very closely with our partners to be able to get the information and track them. For public assistance, we'll be working very closely with the San Antonio Housing Authority, the Bexar County Housing Authority, and Department of Human Services. For job training, we'll be working with the Economic Development Department as well as the City of San Antonio Ready to Work program and those partner agencies. And then for affordable housing, we'll continue to work with our partners. And that's us, Neighborhood Housing Services. That's Bexar County, the San Antonio Housing Authority, and the San Antonio Housing Trust. We've started tracking our pipeline and we'll continue to do that. For the private sector, we're going to be tracking the UDC amendments that we make. So how are we going to pay for this? I think is a question that was included in the housing policy framework as one of the key priorities, creating a funding plan for the next 10 years. Because we were already tracking our pipeline of development over the past 3 years, we had a very good sample size to be able to look from the data. And through that data, we were able to identify the average subsidy per unit, the AMI levels that we were able to achieve, the programs that we were able to utilize to achieve those AMI levels, and the funding sources that we were able to use. Through that exercise, we were able to see that new goal of 28,000 units represents approximately $3.3 billion in funding over the next 10 years. And we would be able to leverage $1 billion of locally directed funding against $2.3 billion. The funding sources that we looked at included the housing bond at $150 million for this cycle and another bond of $150 million in 2027. Our affordable housing budget, this is the budget that our department utilizes for our affordable housing programs now, includes general funds, federal funds like home and CDBG, any recapitalized or program income that we receive, city fee waivers, and our affordable housing fund. We looked at home ARPA. Most of these sources project into the future and can be used year over year, but home ARPA is a significant investment. This is the American Rescue Plan recovery funding of $20 million, and it can only be used for housing programs. We looked at tax exemptions. The San Antonio Housing Trust and Bexar County are able to utilize tax exemptions to include affordability in housing developments. The San Antonio Housing Trust issues funding rounds annually based on the income and revenue that they generate. Our federal capital funds that are utilized by the San Antonio Housing Authority, these funds aren't being directed, but we want to make sure that we count and we look at the funding that they are utilizing year over year to repair their residents' homes. Tax increment reinvestment zones. These are zones that are created typically for single family new construction subdivisions where infrastructure may not have been extended to. In exchange for affordable homes, they get a rebate on their taxes to pay off those infrastructure costs, those public infrastructure costs. And then we looked at that against our leveraged funding sources. And so these are the primary funding sources that go into affordable housing. These are things like tax credit, HUD financing, private activity bonds, and any conventional debt that a developer may take out. We also looked at additional resources. We didn't include them in our projections because they're really project by project based. And these include any city assets that we may have, like land, historic tax credits, if the project qualifies for them, or PACE energy funding, if the project qualifies for them. Like I said, we didn't include them in our funding, but as projects come through, we'll be looking at whether or not we can leverage these sources to make our funding stretch even further. So based on the analysis, here is a 5-year and 10-year plan. I think the 5-year is very relevant to this committee since we're looking at a 5-year bond. That 22 housing bond fits right there at the top at $150 million. We have our affordable housing budget, our home ARPA dollars of $18 million, developer initiated TERS, San Antonio Housing Trust, our tax exempt projects, our federal capital funds, and our leverage funding sources. So all in all, we'd be leveraging over $500 million against nearly $1 billion for a total of $1.6 billion. Graphically, this is what it looks like over the 10 years. So you can see how we're strategically using the funding that we have flexibility for against those leverage funding sources. Lastly, in the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan are a variety of strategies. We know that in the housing policy framework, we had strategies left to do, but we also know that a lot of reports were done since the housing policy framework was adopted up until today. These include the Office of Historic Preservation's Opportunity at Risk, the Homelessness Strategic Plan, the For Everyone Home Anti-Displacement Plan, just to name a few. So we were able to create a stakeholder group of over 80 stakeholders and start to work to incorporate all of those different document strategies that related to housing. This is just a visual representation of the strategies that we looked at. Through the development process of the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, we've held numerous meetings. We've had 42 stakeholder forum meetings. We had 4 stakeholder forums, each one with a different expertise and focus. We had real estate and development, affordable housing, residents and community, and policy. Approximately 20 people in each one, and they reviewed the existing plans and initiatives, and they drafted the initial strategies. We also had full ship meetings with each one of those forums coming together, where they were able to review strategies and provide edits. And then we had 10 public meetings over the course of this. And this included meetings at council committees, B session, and Housing Commission. And at each one of these, we take different components of the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. The definition of affordability, the recalibration of our affordable housing targets, setting the new housing targets, and then finally the final plan. In the implementation of the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan, because it is a roadmap, each one of these strategies will have its own public engagement process. When we pick up a strategy, we provided enough detail to let us know who the stakeholders are who need to be at the table, how long it's going to take, possible funding that may be required, and then we will begin a process. We will begin a process of identifying stakeholders, an approval process, going to Housing Commission, Council Committee, and then ultimately to City Council. This is just an overview of our timeline to show the engagement process to date. We were able to select co-chairs to help lead each one of these forums. Those co-chairs did a lot of the day-to-day work and help us refine our languaging, our messaging, making sure that we were tying back to the housing policy framework and tying to other documents. We were able to present to Council Committee and Housing Commission frequently. And then ultimately, we're here in August and November before council approval. We just went to B session today, and we went to Council Committee last week before going to Housing Commission. Talk a little bit about our public engagement here at the end of the presentation, but we're currently in our public feedback process. All in all, there's 36 total strategies. We've categorized them under the 5 key areas included in the housing policy framework. Again, to develop a coordinated housing system, increase investment in housing, increase affordable housing production, rehabilitation, preservation, protect and promote neighborhoods, and ensure accountability to the public. You have a list of these strategies in your PowerPoint. I won't go through every one, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. The one I'd like to highlight from develop a coordinated housing system is to develop a one-stop shop. This is something that we heard from the community within the housing policy framework and more through the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. I think it was highlighted during COVID as having a place for residents to be able to go to have access to a variety of services, not just one service and then be redirected to another one. This could be a physical presence. This could be multiple physical presences. This could be a hybrid of an online presence and a physical presence. So this is something that will be explored. When we talk about increasing city investment in housing, one key factor that was made very clear when we were going through the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan process is that we need to support and grow our nonprofit housing providers. These don't just include nonprofits that help us build the housing, but also the nonprofits that provide the services to our residents that need them. So things like stable sources of funding and clear approval processes help that. When we talk about increasing affordable housing production, rehabilitation, and preservation, one of the key strategies that was highlighted in our Office of Sustainability Plan is to implement sustainable practices in affordable housing design and programs. We know that when we invest into a home, we're also investing into that household's future. There's upfront costs for a unit, but there's also lasting affordability. Things like weatherization, things like lower energy costs play a big role in housing affordability. So we're going to ensure the developments are sustainable, resilient, and energy code recommendations align with the SA Climate Ready goals. When we talk about protecting and promoting neighborhoods, strategy I'd like to highlight is establishing a demolition prevention and mitigation program. We know that the most affordable housing in our community is the housing that currently exists, and we know that our older housing stock is home to some of our most vulnerable and lower income residents. So we want to establish a demolition prevention and mitigation program that allows homes that are slated for demolition to have access to resources to help them avoid it and prevent homes from ending up on the demolition in the first place. When we talk about ensuring accountability to the public, One of the key strategies that was highlighted in the housing policy framework and the strategic housing implementation plan was to develop and implement a displacement impact assessment. We know that through investment, sometimes there are unforeseen impacts that may lead to residents becoming displaced in surrounding neighborhoods. So we wanted to develop an impact assessment that helps us understand what those impacts may be of particular city incentivized projects, and when displacement occurs, support households through relocation to equitable and long-term stable housing. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about this one because I think this one's very relevant to our discussions today and over the next 2 meetings. We wanna look in the short term and the long term at this strategy. In the short term, we wanna prepare a policy for implementation in the upcoming bond. And we want this to help us determine which project types and investment amounts contribute most to displacement. We want to identify the geographic boundaries of areas that may be most at risk of displacement and what that project footprint may be. And then we want to identify mitigation costs and the uses for that funding that may be set aside so that we can help those residents. Long term, we want to see if we can scale this policy to other government entities that may be making investments in our community. We want to analyze comprehensively the impact of displacement, not just on residents and housing, but also jobs and schools, and determine which programs and incentives contribute most. The Strategic Housing Implementation Plan is not only being adopted, as Lori said, by the City of San Antonio, it's also being adopted by our partners that play an important role in housing. The San Antonio Housing Trust and the San Antonio Housing Authority will be looking to adopt this as well, and each one plays a specific role and has a specific clientele. But again, if we're all part of the same system, we want to make sure that we're leveraging each other's resources as best as possible. The San Antonio Housing Trust may be positioned the best to do things like community land trust or land banking. And we want to make sure the San Antonio Housing Authority has the funding that it needs to rehabilitate its existing housing stock. And if it constructs new housing, that includes deep affordability. We want to work with the Housing Authority on advocating for more vouchers and improve the voucher process for landlords and residents. Bexar County, we want to work with on tax burden for homeowners on how we can alleviate that. We want to work with Bexar County on the eviction process and improvements that we can make. And then we want to work together to build more permanent supportive housing for our community. So I talked a little bit about the public input to date and the process that we went through. I think what's really critical to the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan is that we're building off of the framework and we're taking a lot of strategies that have been sourced from other documents. I think one of the first things we heard when we started the process was, I've contributed to SA Tomorrow, Housing Policy Framework, Climate Action Plan. We're doing this again. We've already have a lot of great ideas and they're out there. So I think it's critical to state that the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan is pulling those in and building off all of the community engagement that many of you may have already put into those documents. We were able to work with those stakeholders to draft these strategies. We've had multiple meetings to public boards. And then this month, we've already started having 3 meetings out in the community. They are hybrid, so they're in person and virtual. They're available in English and in Spanish. We have a recorded presentation online so individuals can see the presentation at their leisure. We have documents online, both in English and in Spanish. The whole document itself is about 70 pages, so we have a shortened version in English and Spanish. And we have prints available at request if we need to bring them to meetings. And then the public input process for individuals is both online and in person. If you show up to a meeting, you can tell us your comments there. You can also identify if you want to be part of a strategy going forward. Through this database, we'll be able to reach out when we pick up a strategy and identify individuals who may want to be part of those processes moving forward. Because again, each strategy will have its own public engagement process. The SHIP is really a roadmap that tells us which strategies we need to look at and start addressing. And then each one will go through that process. So the 3 meetings, as I said, we've already started. The first meeting was at UTSA's Westside Community Center, and we already had that. We have a meeting tomorrow at St. Philip's College, and then we have a meeting on the 9th at Ego Library. Again, these are both in-person and virtual. We are going to work with the Housing Commission's Public Outreach and Engagement Subcommittee to ensure that we distribute to communities that may not have access to internet and find ways to make sure that we get the word out about the SHIP and the public engagement process. We'll distribute through the city engagement normal channels, which email, social media, flyers, and then we'll have draft materials, flyers, and social media that will coordinate with our stakeholders, with council offices, with Housing Commission, and neighborhood associations. I think I spoke about this already, but this document is not just being approved by the City of San Antonio, it's being approved by other entities. Bexar County is working on its own housing framework, but we're working very closely with them to ensure that their policies and strategies tie into the strategic housing implementation plan. This is just a detailed timeline of when we started. B session we just had earlier today, the City Council B session. We will be closing our public comment on the 22nd. We've extended that 1 week. We heard some feedback from the community. They like more time. And then we look to be going to council early December. I know that was a long presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
You want me to take over here from Ian? You want me to take over? Yes,
Yeah.
John? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm Shirley Gonzalez, co-chairing with Katie Vela, the housing portion of the bond. Very exciting. The first time the city's had the opportunity to do this. And I'm going to just make a few comments. I'll pass it along. We are going to try to stay a little bit timely. So I would ask about if we can reserve our questions, perhaps just one question per person or two as we move along. I think we've got about an hour, but 30 people. So we'll try to move it along to everybody here at the table. So I think I can speak very confidently on behalf of all of your council members that we are entrusted to do a very thorough job here in this. And so I'm excited to be here. I'll lead this meeting. Katie will lead the next one. And so a couple of questions came up, Ian. I did have the opportunity to hear this presentation now a number of times. But there, in somewhere in your presentation, you give potential uses for these bond dollars. I think there's a sheet here, and it's like a sheet of definitions of potential uses.
So the uses that the bond dollars can be used for, let me see if I can go back to the slide. So the potential uses for the bond dollars are many. Here are some that we've looked at through the Strategic Housing Implementation Plan. So you have preservation or new construction of both rental and multifamily units. And I'm sorry, of single family and rental units. You have community land trust and land banking. You have gap financing. You have buy downs. So we do know that we are able to buy down the rents of certain units down to the appropriate AMI level. For example, 60% AMI to 30% AMI, if that's where the community need is. You have things like community land trusts, where we're able, again, to separate the costs of the home from the land. And that allows the homeowner not to be subject to year-over-year increases in property taxes. And then you have land banking, which is a tool to be able to purchase property right now in the current market conditions and be able to use it in the future for affordable housing when market conditions may have raised and affordable housing is no longer possible in certain areas.
And what about fee waivers?
Fee waivers, absolutely. So
is that an eligible use of bond dollars? Because that's been a
Yes.
question of mine.
Yes.
Okay, it is.
And then one other thing I do want to mention really quickly is community land trust, conversion of mobile home parks or rental units to home ownership. So that is another option.
Okay, I don't see the fee waivers listed. Am I wrong?
It was in Lori's presentation.
Okay. And so I guess, are there any others? My sense is that we need to have full flexibility in decisions that we can turn over to the council members. And I think it would be useful to have all of the potential uses in one space. So as we go about our discussions, we can see where we might have the biggest.
And so they are listed up here. So fee waivers would fall under gap financing. And so it's us offsetting your costs to your project. But really the best way for us to focus on, how to use the dollars is really help us understand what priorities you want us to focus on. And then we can identify the different strategies and how this bond funding can be used to help with those priorities. Because the bond language is going to be very, very flexible, because we need that flexibility to implement the priorities. But it'll be something similar to what Houston had done, where they say $20 million to be used to help with affordable housing for vulnerable populations through the construction, preservation, rehab of affordable housing units.
So for the purpose of today's meeting, is it helpful just to have the questions and then next time give further input? Or are you looking for input today as we're going through this exercise?
I think both. And so
Okay.
if there are questions you have, that's great. Or if there are some comments you'd like to say about, we'd like to see how we can use this money for homelessness or to help with permanent supportive housing, or, what are the homeownership opportunities with using this money? We'd like to hear that feedback so we can better come back with, some draft recommendations on what some priority categories would look like.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I've seen this a number of times, so I think if you'll just raise your hand, and please then, when you're ready to speak, introduce yourselves. If we could have a loose timer of about 3 minutes, so we can give everybody enough opportunity to speak. And I guess I can use my phone for the 3 minutes. So I'll turn it over to Katie to introduce herself, and then we'll ask any questions that you may have, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Sure. I'm anxious to hear from all of you, but thank you. I think that was a great kind of foundation. So we start to understand the full scope, and we have a really important job here to do, because I think we all know through our work and even in our personal life how difficult it can be to locate housing. And there's a pressing need, unprecedented need because of the pandemic. So it's just a really important job we have here. So I'm excited to hear from all of you. And just one quick comment, I think it'd be good for all of us as homework to review the glossary of terms, because it was a lot of information here today, and you can see there some other options we can discuss in our strategies. And one I just wanted to highlight that can be pretty flexible as well is accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. That may fall under a category or program up here, but it's an innovative option to create, more affordable options. So I'll hand it back over to Shirley to start going around the room with questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich, if you could just please introduce yourself and what district you're from, and go ahead and start with your question.
Rich Acosta, District 9. I'm a licensed real estate agent, general contractor, and president of a nonprofit. My first two things that I've already brought up to Ian, but I want to make sure that everybody hears it, is that I don't think that we should be trying to use city taxpayer dollars to fund the development of 120% AMI housing. So that's somebody that makes about, if you look at your documents, it's $80,000 that they're making a year. In my real estate practice, that's somebody that can afford anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 home. I understand that there could be individuals that are cost burdened. There's debt out there and everything, but with the limited dollars that we do have, I think we should focus those dollars on the most that are in need, and not at somebody that's making $80,000 a year. And then the other thing, when it comes to SAHA and vouchers, I work with voucher holders on a daily basis. I have a voucher holder that I got the other day. He's 75 years old, and his vouchers at the level 1, there's different tiers of the vouchers, but it's like $550 a month, right? I can't find them anything for $550 a month in rent. And so we know that SAHA has lowered their voucher limits because they are focusing on development for public housing and everything. So what I would like us to do is help SAHA by putting funding towards public housing, redevelopment, fixing up public housing, and leave the extra dollars that SAHA does have and ask them to focus on increasing the amount that they fund their vouchers to make it at market rate. And there you go. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich. Who's next? Over here, could you please introduce yourself? I can't see too well, so don't take it personally, but go ahead, please introduce yourself and what district you're from.
Amy Casterly, and I'm from District 5. And I wanted to agree with Rich about, I think it's, I don't know what the right word is, but I think it would be wrong for us to recommend that city dollars be used for anything above 60% AMI. But certainly, it's insulting to us to argue or to present a plan that seeks to use city dollars for anything from 100% AMI to 120% AMI. I understand the technique that was used to develop these burdened people who are at risk, that is, that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. But certainly for people who are at the median or above, there are two things you can say about that from an economic perspective. One is that if they're spending more than 30%, they're using their discretionary income to buy a house that's nicer than they could otherwise afford. They're instead of taking a vacation, they're getting a house with an extra bedroom. You know, so it's crazy to say that those people are cost burdened in the same way that somebody who is making less than 30% AMI is cost burdened. We should assume, absent any other evidence, that those people have chosen to spend more of their discretionary income on housing. The second thing is, if it's really true that people in that bracket, the 100% to 120%, can't find homes, then the market is way off. It's not us who should be worrying about that. It's the people who are selling homes who should worry about how they're pricing it. So I think that we should decide, and I hope that the council will be open to changing the SHIP plan, because this idea of using city dollars to fund relatively well-off families does not come from the community forums that you've heard talked about. It comes from the Housing Commission in the last 2 months, and it wasn't talked about at great length. It's not something that has arisen from all of this consensus, and I think it ought not to be in this strategic housing plan.
Thank you, Amy. And did you want to address Ian? And I'm going to put you on a timer too if you want to respond, or
No,
if not.
I'm okay.
Okay, let me go on to whomever. Okay, Mr. Lauro. And De Leon, if you could please introduce yourself.
My name is Lauro De Leon, and I agree with the lady, but it depends on what part of the city you live in. What's affordable to you, it might not be affordable to me. So we should go ahead and dig deeper into this presentation. Also, I would like to say that the veterans' disability pensions should not be included in the poverty level. And I tell you why, because different entities of this government don't do so. For example, the texts don't require you to file them. Also, the utility companies don't require you to put in your disability pensions. Also, to include the veterans' wives after they decease. Some of the wives do inherit full pensions, and they are able to maintain their homes, and some of them don't even get pensions, but they get a small amount of other disabilities. So the veterans from the Korean War and the Vietnam veterans didn't access those rights as other veterans did. They didn't get no orientations. So that's why I'm saying that those pensions should not be included because other entities of the government don't include them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauro. Who's next? Anyone? Dr. Drennan, go ahead. Was I?
Is that it? Are we on? Thank you. I love these conversations and just can't get enough. I love to listen to this. I love to be a part of it. I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm representing District 1. And one of the questions that strikes me with these repeatedly and since before the Mayor's Housing Task Force was we often don't have the conversation about where. And when we think about, and it is, I mean, maybe it's a conversation we could start here, but when we talk about affordable housing, where we think that it should go is a really important question. Because of real estate values, we've seen it recently, like go to the feeder road off of I-10. And, you know, I just personally don't think kids should be raised on the feeder road outside, running along I-10. So this question, you know, the question about where do we want public dollars to go to subsidize? And I believe in that deeply, that we need to subsidize these developments, but where do they go, I think is an important and missing element in a lot of these conversations. And I'm not asking for more work, but I am hoping that we can possibly introduce that topic when we craft language going forward. Thank you.
Settle? That's it? Okay. I do want to clarify the 120% number came from the original task force. Could you?
Yes, that's
get
correct.
That? Right. So it wasn't something that came up recently in the last several months. It was a recommendation from the task force in 2017. Am I right?
No, that's correct. And it's typically used for affordable housing and affordable housing funding that we utilize with our partners, 120% AMI.
Okay, and did you have that chart? I thought I saw a chart at some point that showed the AMI levels and, okay, maybe you could leave that up just as we're discussing it. A few of the people have mentioned the 120 number, so leave it up as we continue our discussion. I saw a hand over here. If you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, Sue Hernandez from District 9, and I agree that I think that we need to find out where people are going. I'd like to learn a little bit more about homelessness. And also I heard someone mention Houston before and some success that they had. And if there are studies on where we place affordable housing and its success, particularly homelessness, whenever I see big areas where there's tents and homeless people going, what does success in other cities look like as far as are those, if we did have affordable housing for people that were previously homeless to live together, or are they better shifted around so that they can be around different populations? So I'm just wondering what kind of success other cities have had with affordable housing and placement of where people go.
Thank you. I think that's a question maybe you could answer. I mean, she's asking about the people experiencing homelessness and what options we have.
So the strategic housing implementation plan does include 1,000 units of what we refer to as permanent supportive housing. And we're recommending that we facilitate the development of those units. And those units would help those that are in shelter, potentially those that are in encampments that don't really want to go to a congregate shelter, or those that are homeless and they really are ready to go to that next step. And so our study showed that over the next 10 years, we need 1,000 permanent supportive housing units to support that. And we can talk more about that at the next meeting and maybe provide you some information on the strategic homeless plan through email communication.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Katie. She has a question.
Yeah, so just one, quick comment on that. So, I mean, there are a lot of root causes of homelessness. Of course, housing is core to that, but it could be light touch assistance where you're quickly rehousing someone, getting them back into community and integrated with a little bit of case management and rental assistance. But I think permanent supportive housing is really reserved for those that have some sort of long-term disabling condition. It could be an intellectual or developmental disability, physical, mental health, substance use. And so what we don't have in San Antonio and Bexar County is site-based supportive housing where the services are on site. And that is an evidence-based model in other communities, and it's just not a resource we currently have. And so that's why it was included in the SHIP, and it also something the bond committee can consider. So happy to share more information about that, but thanks.
Art, go ahead.
So first I want to point out, Art Reinhardt, Council District 9, I think we're the first district to have 3 people ask a question. So I did have a question about the one of the equity principles in the SHIP, talking about accessibility. And I was curious on going back to the where conversation, do we have the liberty to make recommendations on where? As an example, like consistent with that Say Tomorrow in the regional centers, if don't want to prioritize something that's not consistent with what the city's been doing over the last years for growth. So I was curious if we can do that, or if we're mainly focused on the slide you had before with the different type of programs.
No, I think we can absolutely do that. And I want to talk a little bit about the accessibility in the SHIP document. So we're talking locationally. I think that's critical. Accessibility to transit, accessibility to jobs, accessibility to other services. We're all talking about accessibility of the actual unit itself. Visitability standards are things being constructed to ADA standards where an individual has access from a wheelchair. So we're looking at both of those. And then I will say the housing bond evaluation framework that the Housing Commission worked on, which will be used on the back end to score projects, also has that criteria too. So if we have 2 projects that come in to serve 30% AMI households, and one of them is on a transit line near an SA regional center that also has ADA accessibility, that may be a higher scoring project than another. So there's 2 ways to do it.
And then another way to look at the location is look at our existing neighborhoods. Like, do we want to preserve our existing neighborhoods and invest funding in the rehab and repair of those homes? So that's another location option that we should consider, because we do have a goal up there of preserving, I think it was something like 7,000 units. And that is really those units that already exist, and most of them are pre-1960. And so a location could be as vague as in the existing neighborhoods or historic neighborhoods.
Art, you still have a few more minutes. Did you yield the floor?
I'll let someone else talk.
Okay, I have Leela here, and then I think I saw a hand over here. We'll go next. Oh, down at the bottom. Okay, Leela, you want to go ahead, and then the gentleman down at the bottom.
So Art, I think another way to look at that, how you would prioritize location, is to develop funding guidelines where the city is acquiring property in the path of development that then can be let via RFP with requirements on it, for example, for universal design or accessible infrastructure, and we require things like, a digital inclusion in all the units. And so rather than waiting for a developer to come to us with the perfect piece of property, the city goes out and utilizes these dollars to acquire land, in the path of development, in conjunction with, VIA, for example, in their 2040 plan or the SA Tomorrow plan, so that we're not behind the curve always on trying to purchase property where values have already gone up. And we have a really good example of that, which is the aquifer sales tax. When that sales tax was passed, there was no guarantee which properties were going to be purchased. There were guidelines that developed that allowed, the city to invest in properties that met the requirements of the sales tax proposition. So I think we have some models that we could use that would let the city get more value and also have that permanent ownership rather than attempting to control what a developer might do 15 or 20 years from now. If the city owns the property and resells it with covenants on it, it would be perpetually affordable.
Let me just ask a follow-up question to that, Leila. So is that what you're describing, what model is that?
I don't know if it's explicitly addressed. It's kind of a land bank plus kind of model. Denver's doing it right now. They have a transit-oriented development fund where they're capitalizing that fund, and then they're purchasing properties at key nodes along the transit system. Because we know in many cities, in many sprawling sort of Sunbelt cities like San Antonio, people are actually spending as much on cars as they are on their rent. So they could be spending 35% of their income on their personal vehicle and then trying to make, find an affordable unit out of what's left over. And in fact, we do know people who will choose to have a car rather than a place to live. They say, well, I can drive my car somewhere, but I can't drive my apartment somewhere. So if I've got to choose one or the other, I'm going to choose a car. So I think there are some models where you can structure a fund. It would probably fall under maybe the land bank piece was the closest.
And is it legal? And legal, okay, good, because that's obviously very important. And we're still, because we haven't done this before.
Well, that's exactly how we did the neighborhood improvements bond. We purchased property in strategic locations that were identified by the community, and then we put in those RFPs and solicitations what we wanted.
But I'm sorry, Lori, I'm going to interrupt just one second. It wasn't that they were identified from the community. Didn't they have to meet some criteria?
No, the Community Bond Committee identified 12 locations.
Okay, so not necessarily.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, but we're not limited to those 12 locations, but we can be very strategic where we see patterns of development. Let's go buy that property and make sure we preserve some affordability in that area.
Okay.
I would say that's an important note because otherwise you're basically saying to developers, please hold out as long as you can because we have to spend our money in your neighborhood.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman here, if you could please introduce yourself.
Peter Onofre, District 4. I initially was concerned about just having the 3 meetings, and I want to thank Chair Gonzalez and Chair Vela, as well as Mr. Carmona, for facilitating those individual district meetings this week and having the opportunity to ask those questions, because obviously the body of work that's been done is very intensive. And it's excellent work that's been laid out, and the opportunity we have to implement will require a lot of dialogue as we've already started here. So I just wanted to acknowledge that initial engagement. Thank you for that. It was very helpful, very helpful. Also, I also concur with the most vulnerable, but the plan is so comprehensive that we have so many options, and trying to consider it all. And I said it during our initial meeting was the holistic approach. I think we have so many resources, and I think we're at a very transformational place where we can make real change. And the decisions we're making through this committee are going to move it to the next level. So I'm honored to be a part of the committee. The permanent supportive housing is something I'm interested in seeing how that would actually work, how it would be identified, the locations in the city, that whole process, how it would be implemented. But of course, there's so many different options that we need to consider. But the most vulnerable, obviously, that's my priority as well, and I agree with that. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Who's next? Okay, please introduce yourself.
I'm Mike Phillips from District 7. And I would hope to see significant funding from this bond for owner-occupied housing rehab. The charter change is a way for the folks to vote on an idea, and I think that was part of the charter change, is to allow for owner-occupied housing to be put up in a bond. And we've always had kind of a really tiny housing rehab program with the city, and this would be a way to really broaden that.
Okay. Okay, please, over here. And if you could introduce yourself.
Okay. Regarding the repair.
I'm sorry, could you just please introduce yourself?
Excuse me. Regarding the repair, I'm sorry, Linda Ortega, District 5.
Thank you, Ms. Ortega.
Repair rehabilitation, or reconstruction of single-family rental units. What will be the criteria for those people that apply?
We don't know that yet, so that's part of what this committee is here to help guide us with.
Okay, are you going to be, I mean, it could be somebody that has, how about an apartment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And how about if they have a lot of apartments all over the United States?
I don't think that would be a limiting factor.
It would not be a limiting factor? If these are people that are, this is a company, a big company,
So it depends.
versus
So
a landlord, a neighborhood landlord?
it could be. And so
So who would take priority?
we want to hear that from you. So are you saying that you would prefer that we prioritize small community local landlords for bond funding?
Yes,
Okay.
but there are community landlords that also have a lot of properties. And then there's maybe a person that has 1 or 2, 3 properties.
So great. We definitely will put that down. But what I'm hearing you say is that we need to prioritize the local landlords that provide affordable housing.
What I'm saying is that you need to be very strict about who you give this money to.
Okay.
Take into consideration the situation that,
Yes. No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mia. I'm in District 2. I want to push back on a couple of things that some people have already mentioned, both on the preservation and production side. I am going to be really strong and agree with what a lot of other people have said about this subsidizing at 80% and 100% and 120. It does not make any sense to go any higher than 50% AMI in this city. I just want to bring some numbers to the conversation. So this is within San Antonio. NLIHC puts out a report called the GAP report every year, and it looks at the number of families at different AMI levels and how many available and affordable units are available in the city. At 30% AMI, there's only 30 units available for every 100 families who need a unit for 30% AMI. 70% of people at that income level are either out of luck, they're not going to have a home, they're going to overcrowd, they're going to share, they're not going to be in a great situation. 50% AMI, you have a very similar situation, 47 units for every 100 families that need it. Once you get up to 80% AMI and even more at 100, we're at 98 units and 107 units for every 100 families that need it. So Ian and everyone has really highlighted this SHIP process guided by need and guided by where the gap is and where we're going to have the biggest impact. I do not see any need similar to the 47 units and 30 units at lower levels, like at 50% AMI and below. That need doesn't exist at 80% and above, especially the 120% AMI. I know there's more difficulties with the homeownership over rental units, but I just don't see the same need anywhere near. The same numbers come up when we talk about cost burden. So HUD will define cost burden as someone who spends more than a third of their income on rent or housing. And when you spend more than a third of your income on these things, you have to compromise on healthcare, on groceries, on transportation, on a lot of different things, childcare. And it's the same story. 88% of families who are at that 30% AMI level are cost burdened. So I really, really worry about any kind of city money going towards anything below 50% AMI. It's just not where the need is. It's not where we have a gap in the city. And so I want to push back really hard on that. On the preservation side of things, I just wanted to note, we know, there's been conversations about place and the importance of where we do a lot of this work. We know certain districts get targeted for things like code compliance or demolitions, often the same districts that have homes that are built before the 1960s. Older housing stock, of course, is going to have more issues, but it's also a source of affordable housing. So I know there's a lot in here about funding towards preservation, and I just really want to highlight that and push more towards that, because these homes are going to be a big source of affordable housing. People are losing their homes because they can't, afford this fee that code compliance has put on them for too long grass or a minor roof repair that they can't afford. And if that's leading to demolitions, that's a huge loss of a really important affordable housing source in the city. So I want to push back at anything above 50% AMI for production, and then really highlight the need for preservation, especially in these districts 2, 3, 5 that have older housing stock and are also a lower income families overall.
And I just want to clarify, I couldn't hear if you said that there was no funding for preservation. We agree with what you said. Preservation needs to be a priority, and this plan does acknowledge that preservation is a priority. So we totally agree. We have a goal of how many units we need to preserve, and I absolutely agree that that need is within those older neighborhoods, and a lot of those units are pre-1960.
I guess I'll just add my main concern, I think, with the preservation is making sure that it's happening in those districts and those areas that are targeted, that are, where a lot of the lower AMI folks live, and communities that have historically kind of been ignored and have deteriorating housing stock. So I'm glad to see preservation. I just want to make sure it's in the right areas.
Absolutely. And we'll put that under the location category that we all talked about. Thank you.
So Rich has spoken once before. Does anybody who hasn't spoken want to chime in before I call on him again? Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance. So we'll come back in. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Kayla Miranda, and I'm with District 5. I really want to echo a lot of what's already been said, especially regarding the wealth gap and the number of units that are actually needed in the areas of need, which is the majority 0 to 30% AMI. I don't think that we should be worried about production of anything over 50% AMI because the need is not there. Now, preservation, yes, but production, no. And when looking at these numbers, I really don't understand why there's so much production on the rental side and so little preservation. The most affordable home that anyone will have is the one that they're already living in. And the cheapest way to keep people in their homes is to preserve the home that they already have. And we see a whole lot of production. Where is this production going to happen? I mean, I know in District 5, there's majority homes there. So are we going to be tearing down homes, displacing people, then building new ones, or are they not going in our district? That's a huge question that I have here. The lower AMI units, the rental units, the preservation there, they're projecting 909 units for 0 to 30%. That's ridiculous. Another thing that I want to question is the displacement around the creeks. Like, if we're going to be building new properties, are we still displacing people along these areas? Are we still having people move out of their homes, which are affordable, and moving into areas which are not affordable to them because their area taxes is going up and rentals is going up, and they can no longer afford to live in the area that they have lived in for generations. So preservation is not just preserving the building itself, but it's preserving the community and the people that live there.
Okay, I think there's some questions there. Can you answer questions about preservation, production over preservation as it's shown in the ship?
Yeah, sure. I'll just take a second because I know there's still people who want to speak and we're getting close to time. The overall goals, the majority of them are preservation goals. We do have a very high emphasis on preservation on homeownership, and we do have preservation of multifamily units as well. I think I can speak with you a little bit after the meeting, maybe follow up, but I think the emphasis on preservation in the plan is there.
Okay, Jose, go ahead.
Jose Gonzalez, District 1. Ian, the households most at risk graph, that's a snapshot of what is on the ground today, correct? The $95,000 figure?
Correct.
95,000
Yes, that's
person
based
figure?
on the census data, cost burden census data.
And I guess what I was trying to correlate is that it shows that within the income band, the median, the earning band, because we really need to look at what wages are in the city and how hourly wage owners tend to be really some of the most impacted people by what is happening to rising rental rates and rising median income of single-family homes, is that we're talking about 12,665 households and that 30 to 50% median income. Yet in our calibrated targets, we're only assuming that we're going to be able to achieve 2,653 units. And so that I see that there's a real kind of disparity between what we, every report has identified, whether it's the housing policy framework, whether it's SHIP, that.
I'm
Go
not
ahead,
sure
Laura.
we're tracking what document you're looking at. You'll need to show us that because.
Sure, on
we're
page 10.
Page 10 of the PowerPoint.
And which is right before, and then on page 14.
Okay.
Oh, I think what you may be getting at is the 95,000 need versus the housing production targets. They're not matching up numerically.
No, well, if I may interrupt you, is that I really want to bore down in that 30 to 50% AMI, because I think that it is critical that as we look at both part of the corpus of the $150 million that would be available for new unit production, that we need to really create a program that correlates a willingness to provide units in any project that is looking for bond assistance at those AMI levels and beginning to reduce the need that there is for housing units at those programs at that level. I mean, I think that is something, and also just to nitpick for a second, on page 14 under the programs, you talk about incentives to reduce the cost of new construction, but from a semantical perspective, it doesn't clearly articulate that new unit production is going to be a program. And my last comment is that gap funding and unit buy downs is redundant. And I wish that we would take unit buy downs out of our vocabulary completely, because you can put a rent schedule together where you hit the targets that you're looking to have at 30%. We know that the impact that when you rent restrict units at 30% to 50%, it's going to create a gap in your capital stack. And we should just talk about what soft dollars we need in order to get it to balance out.
And Jose, we agree with you, but not everyone at this table is a housing expert in finance. So we were trying to throw out some examples of what gap funding can be. So you're right, housing buy downs, city fee waivers, loans, that's all gap funding. But we want to make sure that this committee understands those different mechanisms that equate to that gap funding. And we'll talk to you later on about how that 95,000 number equates to that 23,000 number. And it's key to note, and we said this, is that there's different ways to help someone no longer be cost burden. We could increase their wages. We could provide them more assistance through vouchers or other state, local, or federal programs. We can do code amendments to allow the private sector to build more affordable housing. So there's different mechanisms. That 95,000 speaks to those that are cost burden. The 23,000 number is the number of units we want to preserve or produce. And that's part of that 95,000. The rest will be accommodated through job training, public assistance, the public sector or the private sector.
I'm going to move us along just because it's getting close to 8 o'clock and we have not heard from District 3, District 8, or did we hear from District 10 yet? Okay, so I'm going to move us along. So is there anybody from District 3? Everybody in District 3, okay. And I'll let you guys have a turn. I know it went really fast.
Thad Rutherford, District 3. Just a clarification, kind of a question clarification. These targets are 10-year targets. They're not, this is a 5-year bond. Is there a 5-year target? Because I think you see some of these numbers in the context of the totality of 28,000 units. I don't, not to discount the 120% AMI, but the percentages are extremely low. And I think if you look at the 5-year targets, or if everyone got to see the 5-year targets, it's a much, much smaller number in the whole context of all the other targets. I don't know if that's a question.
No, I mean, it's a great point. It is a 10-year plan. The way that we've been able to do our analysis on what our funding plan would be is we looked at all the funding sources over those 10 years, assuming that this housing bond gets passed. That's a lot of funding that will allow us to address some of that most critical need at those lower AMI levels, which is more expensive and requires more flexible funding. So I think that over 5 years, we should be able to achieve half of those targets. That's our target. That's what our projections have shown us. But we will be tracking and monitoring this. Things like land banking may delay slightly the production if it's not instant. So, those are things we'll have to track over time.
Okay, let me turn it over to somebody from District 8. You want, go ahead, Jennifer? Is it? I think that's Jennifer.
Jennifer Gonzalez. I'm here with District 8. I was hoping that maybe we could get a little more information. I know it was mentioned on page 22, if I'm correct, the Housing Authority kind of dollars that are available for the production of their housing. I think that, historically, we've always seen the Housing Authority as the developer or the owner of the 30% and below units, whether it's through housing vouchers or the production of public housing. So if we're looking at a projection for the housing bond and a priority is 30% and below, what is the Housing Authority's participation in the creation of those units, in the 30% and below units? Are their units counted in these numbers? They have, 57 million. So, what are their dollars doing? I understand that their money isn't enough to fill the gap in the 30% and below. But I think if they are a provider of those units, whether through vouchers or public housing, maybe that's something we need to understand a little better in the unit count so that we really see how many units we need to produce out of the actual housing bond.
Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So the goals that we've set up, those are the community goals. That's our community need. It's not what the City of San Antonio organization is going to produce. This is what we need in the community. Now, we have our housing partners, which are the Housing Authority and the Housing Trust in Bexar County, and we are all working together to implement these goals. Now, the Housing Authority, we know in their 5-year capital budget, they have $57 million. That money goes to preserve their units. So it goes to preserve 30% AMI and below units. So that's what their money is being used for. We also know that the Housing Authority has a project that they're proposing, and that could potentially be a project that when we go through our processes, we select to fund. And so we've already communicated to them that, yes, we've always supported the Housing Authority's projects. And once they have that project, give us those costs. And just like we did with Wheatley Courts or other projects, we'll incorporate those needs in our 5-year capital plan as well. And so if it's infrastructure, we can do that through a number of ways. It can be done through our street maintenance program, depending on what types of streets. So we need to understand those needs. It could be funded through our capital budget. We could take some bond funding to support those, but we are their partner, just like we are the Housing Trust partners, and we'll help them with that. But their units that they preserve and produce are counted towards this goal. And the Housing Trust, they play a huge role in this. So those units that they do public facilities corporations through, those units that they provide gap funding through their solicitations, those count towards those goals as well. So we're all feeding into each other. And you saw that metrics matrix where each entity is kind of helping us feed our pipeline. And we've been doing that for the past 2 years. That's one of the things we learned, is that we are producing a lot of units independently. And so it's good for us to understand and count everybody's units to help us meet those goals.
Thank you. Let me move us along here to District 10. If we could get some, go ahead.
So Brett Finley, I'm a volunteer for District 10, first time caller, long time listener. I promise to keep my comments brief, Madam Chair. No, so I think it sounds like there's appetite from a lot in the room to really identify and prioritize the population group of 0 to 30% or 0 to 50%. I mean, we can start on slide 9. We talk about households at most at risk. I mean, I'm no mathematician, obviously, but if you just combine those homeowners and those renters, I mean, that's 44,000. Looking specifically at 0 to 30% AMI, that's 44,000 of the 95,000. So if we're just looking and trying to set a foundation of where we want these priorities to start, that's probably going to be a pretty good indication of where we want to start setting some of these target marks. And then from there, obviously, 80% and above is in question right now, but obviously that is a portion of the 95,000. Ian or Lori, can y'all talk about just some of the preservation or production strategies and how y'all kind of came to get those 4,000 some odd households?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. You're right. They were identified in our needs analysis. And we know through our past projects and the projects that we do annually that there is a need at those levels. When we talk about preservation, we do include preservation of rental up to 80% AMI. One thing that we know that we don't want to happen is to lose any affordable housing that's in our community. And so that's why there's goals at 80% AMI for rental units. No production, again, because we've heard through the Housing Commission that our priority for affordability needs to be 60% or below. But we don't want to lose any affordable housing that may have expiring covenants. And then for preservation of single family, we focus mostly on those lower AMI levels. 50% and below is the majority of those targets. And then for production, we go up to 120% AMI. We've seen a great need in our community for that 120% AMI level. We have several nonprofits that work in that space, and be it for them or without them, they wouldn't be able to provide homeownership opportunities for those clients. So we do know that there's a need and there's a demand in that level. It's not the focus of our targets. I think I tried to clearly state that the majority of our targets, 75% or 50% and below of the area median income, but we did align our targets with the full need of that 95,000 households that we see.
Thank you, Ian. And then just as a follow-up there, any of those existing repair, rehabilitation, reconstruction programs in place, would there have to be an adjustment to help fund as far as like program application requirements for funding? Would that have to be adjusted for that 80% or above, 80% to 120 as currently in place? Does that make sense?
I think we would, it depends. If you're talking about specifically for bond funding, I think we would probably need to know the criteria which the committee wants to prioritize, whether it's solely income, whether there's location preferences for neighborhoods or districts that we want to prioritize the funding for. So all those things can be done. And currently our programs, we do income screening, and we're able to identify through equity metrics where households are. And based on their equity metric, certain districts may get a certain allotment of units based on our overall funding.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, I feel like we were just getting going, and it's 8 o'clock, so we are going to wrap up. But hopefully next time we had to get through the formalities. Next time we can go back to having a little bit more conversation and discussion. And so thank you everyone for coming today. And of course, you all can although we probably have to wrap up and get out of the building, but I'm sure everybody would like to catch up and say their goodbyes. Thank you.
And one quick reminder, you can take all of the documents with you. Your binder, your agenda and papers, all of that goes with you. And you can also attend the SHIP input sessions if you specifically have feedback on SHIP. Thank you.